New World Aeternum is the name of the cross-platform release of Amazon's action combat MMORPG New World, which initially released on PC back in 2021. I've always thought that New World would be the perfect MMO to play on controller, considering that it's got a bit of a Souls-like combat system, and on October 15th, 2024, players on PC, Xbox and PlayStation will be able to play together. Since its initial release, New World has had a ton of updates bringing new weapons, regions, content and enemies to the game, but considering it's about to get an influx of new console players who have never played the game before, today we're going to focus on giving an overview for each of the various weapons in the game, popular builds, which builds I think are best on controller, a look at the skill trees, combat mechanics, and ultimately help new players get off on the right foot when entering the world of Aeternum. This video is sponsored by New World, so click the link in the description below to purchase the game on your platform of choice ahead of the cross-platform release on October 15th. Starting out in New World, you'll go through an intro cutscene, then instantly be given a choice on which archetype you want your character to start as. This is a new addition to New World, and just to be clear, this archetype choice only affects your starting weapons and armor. In this game you can level up every single weapon and switch builds with no friction. So whilst you may see this menu and assume this is your class selection like in other MMOs, New World is a classless game. No need for alts, you can do everything on one character, tank, heal, DPS, you are whatever you've got equipped essentially. As for the starting archetypes, you've got Soldier, who uses a sword and shield plus hatchet weapon combo, primarily tank focused but with the option to DPS. Destroyer combines the use of a warhammer and great axe. It's more damage and controlled focused than the Soldier, but it's still quite a tanky early choice. Ranger uses bow and arrow spear, a nice DPS option provided you're able to hit your shots and kite enemies. Musketeer, the old rapier rifle combo, with rapier being extremely good DPS close range and rifle picking off foes from afar. Occultist, this is probably your best choice if you're a fan of playing mages in your MMOs, as this one combines the elemental magic of frost and fire with the ice gauntlet and fire staff for solid AoE damage and control. Mystic would be your early game healer support focused option utilising the life staff and void gauntlet, and Sword Bearer, my personal favourite archetype, which uses a giant greatsword for massive cleaving damage, as well as a blunderbuss to soften up enemies from medium to short range. Like I said, archetypes only give you access to your desired playstyle in the early game, as previously everyone had to start with a sword and shield and it took a bit of time to find your desired weapon. There's nothing stopping you from using any weapon combo outside of the starting archetypes. For example, many players like to combine rapier with spear or rapier with ice gauntlet, fire staff or void gauntlet. There's viable build choices for most weapon combos, so my advice would be to start with an archetype that you think looks cool, with the intention of trying out every weapon to figure out which one you find the most fun. Once you've customised your character, you'll choose a name, then enter the world of Aeternum aboard a blazing ship where you'll go through a tutorial phase teaching you about the game's various combat mechanics. New World doesn't play like a traditional MMO with tab targeting. It's instead more like an action RPG where you can dodge, block and interrupt your enemies. On controller specifically, New World controls very similar to a Souls game, and feels quite different in numerous ways compared to mouse and keyboard. Pressing in the right analog stick locks your focus to the target. You're then able to switch your focus between multiple targets by moving the stick left or right. B is your dodge. The speed and distance of your dodge is determined by the weight of the armor you have equipped. With heavy armor, the dodge will be a short evade. With medium armor, it'll be a medium hop. And with light armor, you'll do a full dodge roll. Keep this in mind when coming up with your own build. Additionally, when dodging, it's important to keep track of your character's stamina, as if you spam the dodge button too much and deplete your stamina to 0, there'll be roughly 5 seconds where you're unable to dodge again. RT is your standard attack button, however there's two types of attacks, light attack and heavy attacks. To do a light attack you tap RT, and to do a heavy attack you hold it for more damage. Each weapon has its own light attack and heavy attack weapon combo, so be sure to test each one out. Other than that, you can press LT to block, A to jump, and pressing A whilst jumping near a ledge will cause your character to climb. On top of that, each weapon has 6 unique abilities associated with it, 3 of of which you're able to equip at once. You'll unlock abilities from gaining weapon mastery levels as you use your weapons out in the world. You can then open up your weapon skill tree and choose which perks and abilities to spend your points on. Early on, you should really try out all of your weapons abilities and experiment as much as possible, not worrying too much about spending your points, as at low weapon mastery levels it's completely free to respec, and even at max level weapon mastery, respecking doesn't cost much. Finally, pressing Y switches your weapon. You can equip any 2 weapons at once in New World, and the weapon's abilities have independent cooldowns, so it's usually beneficial to swap weapons and rotate abilities if they're off cooldown. Other, more advanced combat mechanics to be aware of include feinting. This is something more utilised in PvP, however this is basically where you load up a heavy attack, and before the animation plays out you cancel the animation either with a dodge roll, block, or even another ability to catch your opponent off guard. Line of sight is another thing to be aware of, especially when fighting large groups of enemies. Ranged enemies can't do damage to you if there's no path for their projectiles to physically hit you, so bear that in mind. Next, let's dive a little deeper into each of the weapons in New World, as well as my thoughts on which ones are better suited to controller gameplay or mouse and keyboard. One-handed weapons include the sword and shield, rapier, hatchet, and flail and shield. Each of these weapons feel equally as good on controller as they do mouse and keyboard, if not slightly better. The sword and shield is primarily a weapon used by tanks due to its defender talent tree, and the tremendously strong defender's resolve ability, which reduces incoming damage from attackers as well as reducing stamina damage. The swordmaster talent tree does give options for those wanting some DPS, and damage for this weapon scales at 90% with strength and 65% with dexterity. The rapier is one of the highest DPS output weapons in the game and is recommended in multiple meta builds in both PvP and PvE. The rapier's blood talent tree is where most of the DPS will come from, with a focus on bleed damage and rapid lunging attacks, whereas the grace talent tree offers more in mobility with abilities such as evade and riposte. The rapier's damage is scaled at 90% with dexterity and 65% with intelligence. The hatchet is another strong weapon, with its most iconic ability being Berserk in the Berserker tree. This ability basically makes you unstoppable for 12 seconds with lifesteal on attacks and increased move speed. This tree is also super useful for the Defy Death ability, which gives you one final stand upon receiving lethal damage. The throwing talent tree basically turns the hatchet into a ranged weapon. Not my cup of tea personally, but it's cool that it's an option. The hatchet is scaled at 90% with strength and 65% with dex, making it a good weapon to pair with the sword and shield. The flail and shield is a really solid secondary weapon for both healers and tanks, with the cleric talent tree allowing healers to contribute to dealing damage with the benefit of passive healing, and the bastion tree providing tankiness with fortify and damage mitigation. The flail and shield is scaled 90% with strength and 65% with focus. For two-handed weapons we have the spear, great axe, warhammer and greatsword. As pure melee weapons with no need for precise aiming, I personally find the gameplay with these to feel superior on controller compared to mouse and keyboard. The spear excels in crowd control, stunning and knocking down foes, as well as reducing the cooldowns of abilities upon successful hits. The spear has two talent trees in the form of Zoner and Impaler, with Zoner focusing more on heavy attacks, crowd control and stamina, and the Impaler tree focusing more on light attacks, debuffs and critical strikes. The spear's damage scales 90% with dex and 65% with strength. The Great Axe is a brutal cleaving weapon, perfect for the Giga Chads that like to rush in and take on multiple enemies at once. The Reaper talent tree excels with gap closing as well as life leech, with abilities Charge, Reap and Bloodlust, making it very difficult for an enemy to escape you. The Mauler talent tree on the other hand is more AoE focused, and is more about sucking up enemies into a big pile with you standing in the middle of them dealing huge damage. The Great Axe's damage scales 100% with strength and nothing else. The Warhammer, another weapon that's damage scales 100% with strength and nothing else. This brutal chunk of metal provides some of the best stuns and AoE crowd control in the game, with its Juggernaut talent tree having grit on every ability if you choose to, meaning your attacks cannot be interrupted, and the Crowd Crusher talent tree doing exactly what it says on the tin, crushing crowds of enemies once they're grouped up either with knockbacks, stuns or staggers. The Greatsword. Personally, this is my favourite weapon in the entire game due to its cool animations, big damage, and fun versatile playstyle. The Greatsword is the only weapon in the game with equal damage scaling on 2 attributes at 80% for both strength and dex, meaning it's got a lot of options when paired with other weapons. As for the talent trees, you've got Onslaught and Defiance. Onslaught is the more aggressive talent tree with a focus on gap closing, heavy attacks and burst damage, whereas Defiance is a more balanced playstyle providing defensive and countering capabilities. New World's ranged weapon lineup includes the bow, musket and blunderbuss. Personally, I'd say these weapons feel much better to play on keyboard and mouse compared to controller due to the precise aiming required to get the most out of them. Both the bow and musket benefit from increased damage when you get a headshot on an enemy. This is obviously easier with keyboard and mouse. The blunderbuss doesn't however benefit from headshot damage, so out of the 3 ranged weapons this one does feel the best on controller. The bow's 2 talent trees include the Skirmisher, which is more for archers who prefer getting up close and personal as well as kiting enemies, and the Hunter tree is more for the static hunter who wants to stay back at long range dealing massive damage from afar. The bow scales 100% with dexterity and is one of the highest skill weapons in the game due to needing a good aim to play it to its potential. If you miss your arrow shots, you're dealing 0 damage, so it's high risk, high reward gameplay in that regard. The musket. Similar to the bow, your options include staying back and dealing big damage from afar with the sharpshooter talent tree, provided you can hit your shots that is, or getting into the action by placing traps or throwing bombs with the trapper talent tree. Whilst the musket doesn't benefit from the same mobility as the bow, one advantage it does have is that it's a hit scan weapon. You don't need to lead your shots at long range like you do with a bow, so if you've got a good aim or experience with shooters, then you could be a menace with this weapon. The musket's damage is scaled at 90% with dex and 65% with intelligence. The blunderbuss is a mid to short range weapon that's great for both AoE and single target burst damage. The containment talent tree is focused around impeding your enemy's movements with slows, and the chaos talent tree is all about bombs, blasts and explosives. The blunderbuss scales with strength at 90% and intelligence at 65%. Next, the magic weapons, of which we have the Fire Staff, Life Staff, Ice Gauntlet and Void Gauntlet. As for how these feel to play on controller compared to mouse and keyboard, I'd say they're okay, but with the AoE abilities, some of which need to be precisely placed manually, I can see some situations where mouse and keyboard users would be at an advantage. The Fire Staff. I personally love this weapon, and the Fire Mage talent tree is one of my favourites in the game, with a focus on casting big damage AoE fireballs and dealing damage from afar. The Pyromancer talent tree does lend itself to a more close range playstyle with its focus on the application of burning damage stacks. However, one ability from this tree that I love in particular is Burnout, which is a great damage dealing mobility spell that you can use to kite enemies. The Fire Staff scales 100% with intelligence and nothing else. The Life Staff. This will be the main weapon for any healer, with both talent trees offering good abilities that you can switch in and out of depending on the situation. As for the talent trees themselves, you've got the Healing tree, which is more focused on raw healing, especially when your target's below 50% health, and the Protector tree, which is more focused on buffs and healing over time. The Life Staff scales 100% with focus and nothing else. The Ice Gauntlet. If you're looking for a pure mage playstyle, then this is likely the weapon that you'll choose to pair with the Fire Staff. The Ice Tempest tree has 3 AoE abilities to choose from, whilst the Builder tree focuses on using your ice spells to build things to help you in combat without any direct damage dealing. The Ice Gauntlet has some nice abilities in both trees, with my favourites being Ice Storm in the Tempest tree and Ice Pylon Ice Shower in the Builder tree. Ice Pylon is an especially notable ability, as it's one of the few abilities in the game that basically provide off-field DPS when you've switched to another weapon. You put down the pylon, switch weapons, and it persists, dealing damage to enemies for 15 seconds. The Ice Gauntlet's damage scales purely with intelligence and nothing else. The Void Gauntlet is the only hybrid magic weapon that scales with 2 attributes, with its damage scaling at 90% intelligence and 65% focus. This magical gauntlet gives you the ability to both heal and deal damage, whilst also providing some nice utility. The Annihilation tree basically turns your Void Gauntlet into a magical melee weapon that heals yourself and allies as you attack, and the Decay tree is more focused on debuffing your enemies. Now that I've given you an overview for the Archetypes gameplay and every weapon in the game, I want to end this video by giving some advice to new players who have never played New World before. Number 1, metagaming is a huge thing in MMOs nowadays, and you're probably going to see a lot of videos about weapon tier lists, what deals the most DPS, and so on. My advice would be to not stress over this too much, especially in the early game, and just pick the playstyle that's the most fun for you. New World is a very casual friendly game, and basically every weapon has its place in this game. The more seriously you take this game, the more you try to be a top 0.1% player, the less fun you're going to have, in my opinion. Number 2, take your time and enjoy the novelty of being a new player in New World. I remember back at the PC launch for this game, I had so much fun just exploring the world and discovering everything for the first time. I reckon you'll have more fun if you avoid guides and just enjoy being a noob for as long as possible. Looking back on my own MMO experiences, being a noob is always the most memorable time, so enjoy it whilst you can. But that's it for this video. I hope it helped give you a rough idea of what to expect with the gameplay in New World, as well as what weapons to choose. Shout out to Amazon Game Studios for sponsoring today, and click the link in the description below to buy New World on your platform of choice for the cross-platform release on October 15th. Let me know your favourite weapon combos in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Aeternum.